Welcome back, everybody, to What Really Matters. I'm Tablet Deputy Editor Jeremy Stern with you in Los Angeles. I'm here as always with Walter Russell Mead, Tablet news writer, Global View columnist at The Wall Street Journal, and distinguished fellow at Hudson. Let's start with this week's news. First story of the week. We've talked on the show before, Walter, about the post-pandemic economy in which Americans have reported feeling pessimistic, even as quantitative indicators have remained pretty good. But now, according to CNN, those indicators may be taking a turn for the worse, at least when it comes to employment. Per a report from the Bank of America Institute this week, the unemployment rate rose to a three-year high of 4.1% in June, up 0.5% from a year ago. The median duration of unemployment rose to 9.8 weeks in June, the highest since January 2023. And the quits rate, how often people leave their jobs, has remained stagnant at 2.2% for 7 months after reaching 3% during the pandemic. Meanwhile, the median pay raise for those Americans who do switch jobs has dropped back below pre-pandemic levels. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, it's news. It's probably mostly political news in that it blunts people's perception that under President Biden, the economy has been improving. And that clearly could be a factor in November. In terms of actual economic outcomes and how people live, these are not big numbers. You know, the American economy is like a large mountain. This is like it's like an earthquake that doesn't raise or lower the height of Mount Everest very much. And nothing is altering the fact that Americans today are enjoying the highest standards of living in American history. Nothing is changing the reality that Americans have more choices in where they work and where they live than before. And there are more ways you can improve your situation if you find yourself stuck or in a bad spot, which is not to say that this is utopia either. America's not turning into some magical place where every wish is immediately fulfilled. But these statistical indicators, while it's interesting and economists, pore over them with magnifying glasses, and if you're a businessman, it makes, do I invest in this? Do I open a new kind of store? That kind of thing makes, you want to understand these things. But for those of us whose primary interest is keeping an eye on where things are going in general, this is not really a big deal.
Speaking of November, I know it's kind of a weird question, but at this juncture, what's your sense of how important kind of traditional issues are going to be to the election? I mean, normally you'd think things like the unemployment rate, jobs creation, inflation, like these are things that can really bring down presidents or elevate them to power. But this election it seems so heavily dominated by what you might call non-traditional questions, like is the convicted felon challenger a threat to democracy? Is the senile incumbent actually in charge? Or are these just questions that preoccupy Twitter while the median voter still really just cares more about inflation?
I think voters tend to vote based on a whole mix of considerations. The traditional issues that people say matter. Political scientists have to work really, really hard to come up with any kind of predictors. And pretty much all of them end up not actually predicting the future of politics. And even if you get lucky and you predict one election, the chances are the dynamics will change in the next. But really, we're in a period of profound social and economic change. And so trying to sort of draw a pattern, well, back to 1948, elections have always turned on X, Y, and Z. We're of course, we're in an unusual situation. And of course, in that situation, you can't simply rely on these traditional matters. But at the same time, of course, in that situation, the rate of inflation does matter. The unemployment rate does matter. It's a mix.
All right, our second story. The GOP released a new Trump-endorsed platform this week that considerably softened the Republican Party's stance on abortion. The new platform drops language from the two previous platforms endorsing a federal 20-week abortion ban and the, quote, right to life of the unborn child. Instead, it says merely that, quote, states are free to pass laws protecting those rights. Trump reportedly considers abortion to be his biggest vulnerability in the 2024 election. The platform also includes pledges to seal the border, end inflation, deport pro-Hamas radicals, and, quote, build a great Iron Dome missile defense shield over our entire country. Walter, news or faux news?
Well, it's always news when a major political party issues its platform. And it's also news when that platform indicates that that the nominee of the party either is or isn't in control of the party bureaucracy. What's very clear here is that Donald J. Trump is in charge of the Republican Party. It adopts the stands that he thinks are most useful. It's cut the platform way back in length. All of this, by the way, regardless of the content, which is another question, I think is good. I think party conventions and party platforms are among the sort of outmoded, weird institutions we have that don't serve any function these days. I mean, this sort of, at least the British royal family attracts tourists to Britain. I would say that the American system of conventions and platforms is much less useful than that. So the fact that Trump is playing with both, and that the clear collapse of the party as an institution is being reflected in this. We can learn a lot about changes in American politics from watching what's happening there. As for the content, I think it's kind of reasonable that we don't try to dictate a single national policy on abortion. I think Trump is right that to try to do that is a political liability for the Republican Party. Now, the problem, of course, is that a big element of Republican politics in recent years has been the right to life movement, a big and very dedicated movement. And some in that movement will see and will say that they see that this is a betrayal. Will that reduce the enthusiasm of Trump volunteers? Will it mean that voters who might have voted for him otherwise won't do so? We'll see. I mean, I don't think we're going to get a lot of members of National Association of Women or NARAL coming down to the polls to support the new Donald Trump. So I don't know that he's necessarily going to be winning a lot of votes on the left with this approach. But it's also interesting in that it shows a Trump who is much more calculating politically, I would say, than in 2016 or 2020. He's working very hard and thinking very systematically and clearly listening to some advice that he's getting from professional advisors in ways that he didn't always in the past. So this is, an interesting sign about what a Trump administration might look like.
All right, final story of the week. France held the second round of its snap parliamentary elections, resulting in a surprise victory for the far-left New Popular Front, a motley alliance of communists, socialists, Greens, and France Unbowed, a left populist party led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon. The right-wing coalition led by Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, which finished first in first-round voting, won the most votes overall, but finished third in the number of seats won. The NFP's platform calls for increased social spending, a decrease in the retirement age, a wealth tax, carbon neutrality, recognition of Palestine, and an expansion of immigration to France, including for so-called climate refugees. The NFP does remain about 100 seats short of a majority, so it will likely have to govern in coalition with Macron. Walter, news or faux news?
I think that the real news in here is that the French right, like the British right, is deeply split between a kind of, you might say, cosmopolitan, outward-looking establishment right and an insurgent populist right. And this, in Britain, that led to the Reform people splitting off from the traditional conservatives, which meant that Labour, which only had 1 or 2% higher vote total, sweeps to the largest majority in its history, even though voter sentiment between right and left hadn't switched much. And in the same way, I think the split between the Macron right and the populist right, and then in fact the old Gaullist right, split a right-wing majority into unequal portions and allowed the left to move through. The split in France between the Macron right and the Le Pen right is so deep that the Macron right helped ensure a big left-wing victory by having their candidates drop out in favor of, where it would help the left-wing candidate, and the left-wing candidate had gotten more votes in the first round. We see the same kinds of issues in another way in the European Parliament, where the fight between right and far right is such a big deal. In a sense, in the United States, the establishment right is a smaller factor, so that President Trump and the populist right have been able to more or less take over the Republican Party and largely marginalize that center right group. Well, what does it mean? Where's it going? We should remember this was not so much a victory for the far left in France as a kind of accident that gives them a lot of seats in parliament. Now, that's fun. You have a lot of seats in parliament, but if you don't have a majority, you're in trouble. And the true hard left in France is, I believe, not even a majority of the left-wing minority. So we've got kind of a tail trying to wag the dog situation here. How much success they'll have, we don't know. French politics, French parliamentary politics for 150 years have seen all kinds of coalitions getting pulled apart, feuds, deputies leaving one party, joining another party. And this left-wing coalition is very kind of fragile. So there's a good chunk of them that actually probably have a bit more in common with Macron, especially if Macron modifies some of his proposals, than they do with the far left. Now, whether they will be able to, the Macron people will be able to sort of very cleverly separate the sheep from the goats and form their own party, it's possible. There's another sort of Gaullist right-wing party out there that's also willing to, I think, come along in some sort of an effort like that. But whether you do that or not, some of it has to do with personality, some of it will have to do with issues. And it is, we haven't seen Macron or his team work effectively in this kind of situation before. So it's all up for grabs. But in general, what's going to be happening in France is that you're going to have a little bit like the British after Brexit, a majority that has chosen something that it is very difficult to make a success of without some pretty disciplined and focused policies that don't have a majority. And that probably does not bode super well for the French economy and perhaps for the European economy in the months ahead. But we'll see. Maybe they'll work it out.
You're kind of used to following the balance of power in the European Union, or in NATO for that matter, by following, who's stronger or more predominant at the moment, France or Germany. What does it mean for the continent if both France and Germany are facing kind of slower growth, a lack of domestic consensus, inward-looking politics, and so forth?
Well, I would say that's largely been true for the last 20 years. So we're somewhat used to it. In some ways, since unification, while Germany has been a very powerful country in Europe, it has been very much more preoccupied by what's going on inside than what's going on outside. And the French, ever since German unification, have been well aware that they no longer can really claim the position they used to have as a kind of equal of Germany. And yet what we've seen for roughly 35 years now, something like that, we've seen stasis, and the European Union solves small problems. It compromises, it moves forward, it fudges, it brought in the euro, it survived the euro crisis, it survived all kinds of political shocks, but it never seems to become it never seems to gain on the world at large. It never seems to become better suited. It tries to keep up with the changing world, but it doesn't seem to get ahead. I'm not looking to see big changes in that in the next couple of years, but who knows?
All right, that does it for the news this week. Let's have the big conversation. You took a look earlier this week, Walter, at what you've been calling for many years Asia's Game of Thrones, and a lot seems to be happening on that front. Putin recently went to North Korea and Vietnam. Xi was in Central Asia. Modi went to Moscow. all as NATO leaders gathered in Washington to celebrate its 75th birthday. So tell us what you read in the tea leaves here and what dynamics you think our listeners need to know about in the Indo-Pacific.
Well, the first point that I wanted to make in the column and want to hammer home here is that we really have reached a place in world history where what matters outside of Europe matters more than what happens in Europe. This is not 1914 when a small quarrel in the Balkans turns into the biggest thing that's ever happened globally. It was Indian External Affairs Minister Jaishankar. You said that Europe wants to see that Europe wants the world to think that that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but that the world's problems are not Europe's problems, and that era is over. With the rise of India, the rise of China, the rise, not so much the rise of Russia, but the transformation of Russia into an aggressive military power, the continuing importance of Japan, the technological advances in places like Taiwan and Vietnam and beyond. Asia is a much more economically dynamic and politically important part of the world. And it lacks a strong security structure. The balance of power in Asia is very much contested, where China is pressing to achieve a kind of hegemonic stance. And for now, at least, the Russians have been willing to go along with that. And that is clearly, that's just a bigger deal than anything happening in Europe today. Now, if I were European, I'd be very happy about that, because it's not actually good news for you when your hometown is the center of the world's attention. It's actually much better when you're sort of a quiet, peaceful, prosperous backwater. Nothing important ever happens in your town. People just quietly make money, make nice livings, have a nice life, enjoy their friends in your town, and have wonderful picnics in the surrounding hills. That's excellent. Big armies marching through and climactic battles being fought, or ideological conflicts being fought out in your street that the whole world is interested in, that's bad. You don't want that. So it's not necessarily good news for Asia and bad news for Europe that the world is changing in this way. But it does mean that we all need to learn to follow world politics with a different kind of lens. And again, European politics, they're very easy for Americans to follow who want to. I mean, a lot of us are too bored to do it or too busy with other things. But if you want to seriously sit down and understand what's going on in France or England or Germany or Italy, Denmark, whatever, you can do it. Your newspapers, our great newspapers have thicker networks of correspondence and so on, often in Europe than we do in other parts of the world. The political ideas that are current there are more like ours. The chances are you may have visited a number of these countries or have friends from whatever. There's more connection. With the Asian countries, a country like Malaysia or Indonesia, it's just very hard for Americans to read their politics. They move in very different ways. A political party in Denmark is not the same thing as a political party in Indonesia or Bangladesh. Thai politics are often difficult for the Thais to follow, much less anybody else. And then you have countries like like China and Russia, where deliberately news about what's going on at the top of national politics, they try to both suppress news and generate kind of artificial pictures, propaganda-style pictures of what's happening. It's much harder to know what Xi Jinping thinks about the world than it is to know what Donald Trump thinks about the world. So all of these things make it difficult. And then the power dynamic. So I'll take one example. On Putin's recent trip to the Far East, he visited North Korea, as people know. And there was this was out of that, clearly some military and economic cooperation happened. We don't know all the details. We know that Russia has been buying weapons from North Korea. Now, a lot of people would see that simply as the deepening of the new axis of evil of the revisionist Russia, China, North Korea, Iran. Unambiguous bad sign, makes Russia a bigger threat. Some of that is true, but it was also what Putin was doing there also was he was sort of stepping on Xi Jinping's toes a little bit. China actually kind of thinks that North Korea should be, North Korea has a big brother already, and its name is China. And North Korea needs to be a more cooperative member of China's emerging civilization of friendly states. North Korea wants independence, like the sort of central ruling idea of the North Korean government is this concept of juche, self-reliance, self-determination. They don't want to be swallowed up by China. They don't want to be swallowed up by Japan or the United States. And having this relationship with Russia is like oxygen for North Korea. It's a friend outside of China. It gives it more independence of China. China doesn't like the idea that North Korea at any moment could just, test a nuclear weapon and create a whole big crisis in Northeast Asia at a time that might not be the time China wants this crisis. So Putin is both shoring up Russia's war in Ukraine, and he is asserting his independence of China. He is also taking a step toward dealing with his domestic critics. The strongest critics of Putin domestically in Russia aren't really the sort of Democrats that we look at and we say, oh, it's really too bad. These wonderful Democrats, they could really take Russia in a better direction. They might, but they're not what would replace Putin, or they're not the people whose arguments might change the direction of Russian policy. The real argument in Russia these days is about whether Putin's policies of hostility to the West and war in Ukraine are turning Russia into a Chinese vassal state, whether in its desire to assert its independence and power in the West, Russia is giving up its independence and power in the East, and China is a bigger threat to the future of Russia than the EU. That's the argument that smart Russians, well placed in the Russian government, that's what, that's the argument they make. And it's, it has some legs. But this trip, both to North Korea and then to Vietnam, another country which has a bad relationship with China, not as bad as Americans would like, maybe, but a challenging relationship with China. This says to Russia, says to Putin's internal pro-Western opposition, look at me. I am actually safeguarding the Russian independence and greatness, and I can force China to respect it because of my diplomatic skill and my will. So this summit does a lot more work than, say, the NATO summits do, where basically leaders are getting together with photo ops and, sort of pre-signed communiques and sort of orchestrating pretty pictures for the folks back home. But in Eurasian summits, you tend to have more substance and more real decisions are taken by the only people in those countries that are empowered to take those decisions. I would also just point to Modi's trip to Russia, to Moscow. A lot of people in the United States want to judge the U.S.-India relationship by is India moving away from Russia, which has historically been a very close associate of India. And there's a lot of bitterness among many in the U.S., especially among people who really care about the future of Ukraine, that India is refusing to join the kind of liberal alliance against Russia and for Ukraine. If the world is really divided between authoritarians and democracies, isn't it treasonous on the part of the world's largest democracy to side with the authoritarian Russia against democratic Ukraine in this war and against, obviously, Russia's violations of international law? So I've seen a number of people sort of using this as a sort of, India has failed a major test. And so we have to think about it in a new way. And I would say, first, no one should be surprised that Modi went to Russia. And interestingly, after a disappointing result in the last election for Modi, he's still in power, but now as a coalition rather than the supermajority that he once hoped for. It's a way, again, for him in domestic signaling. It's showing that India is not becoming a puppet of the West. It's showing that in spite of its closer relationship with the United States, which makes a lot of Indians very nervous for some of the same reasons that Russia's close relations with China make a lot of Russians nervous. So he's showing his independence. But internationally, for India, this Russia-China alliance is a total nightmare, because what we see is that China has become Pakistan's closest ally. Russia is now cozying up to China and possibly then also to Pakistan, leaving India, which is in some way, India now exposed to a grand Asian coalition that is very threatening. And Chinese diplomacy and military activity in the Maldives, in Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. It's sort of, India looks around it and sees just lots of trouble everywhere it looks. This is not healthy. Oh, and I should add Iran to the group potential coalition. So Modi wouldn't be doing his job if he didn't try to sort of suss the situation out in Russia, see what he can get from Russia, see if there are ways he can keep that line of communication open. And that's, I don't think it stops India from gradually tilting toward the United States as these other problems get worse, and as the Russia-China relationship does, at least for now, continue to deepen. So anyway, all this is a very complicated set of illustrations to just say that for people who really want to understand what's going on in the world, we're going to have to become familiar with the agendas of these countries, the personalities of their leaders, the history of their foreign policy, the nature of their culture. A lot of us are going to have to reprogram ourselves from being Euro obsessives to being Indo-Pacific mavens. And following these summits is actually one good way to, begin to push yourself to develop the kind of understanding that will enable you to be a solid analyst of international politics in the world that we're heading towards.
All right, that does it for the big conversation. Let's end on the tip of the week. You read dozens or maybe hundreds of books a year, Walter, and we're at about the midway point of 2024. So tell us, what's your favorite book you've read so far this year?
I would actually say it's a book by Ben Steele, an old colleague of mine at the Council on Foreign Relations, about the life of Henry Wallace, the world that wasn't. It's actually Ben really knows the sort of 1940 to 1950 era in American politics and economic policy better than just about anybody. And his books on the Bretton Woods system and so on are just really insightful. But in this one, he takes on the really strange story of Henry Wallace. This is essentially a biography of Henry Wallace, who for a sort of period of time between about 1946 and 1949, 1950, really goes off the rails and, sort of allows himself to be used by American communists and others in all kinds of strange and bizarre ways. He was Franklin Roosevelt's vice president between 1940 and 1944. Roosevelt's decision to drop Wallace from the ticket in 44 and replace him with Harry Truman might be the single most important political decision an American president made in the 20th century. And it's one that most people just really haven't thought much about and know very little about. I would say that reading this book, for me, first of all, was just delightful. Ben's a good writer, and it's fun to read. But it was also just opening the window onto some political ideas and concerns that have really, really helped me sharpened my understanding of that period in American history.
All right, there you have it. Thanks to our producer, Noam Bloom. Thanks to Will Cummings at Hudson and my co-host, Walter Russell Mead. I'm Jeremy Stern. We'll see you next week. And until then, please go rate and review us. This helps other people find the show.